Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Richard Evans. I'm a visiting professor of history. And I'm going to give a series of 4 lectures, one a month until Christmas, in which I want to discuss the origins, course, and consequences of the Second World War from a German perspective. My aim is not just to explain how the war came about, why Germany conquered most of Europe with such apparent ease, when the tide of war turned against Germany and why, and what the reasons were for Germany's eventual defeat, but also to explain and explore the unusual, even in many respects unique, nature of the war that Germany waged, particularly in Eastern Europe, to show how the war was experienced by ordinary Germans, both members of the armed forces and civilians on the home front, and to assess the changing levels of support from the war effort amongst German people as a whole. So this is about Germany and the Second World War, very much focusing on the German experience. But of course it has much wider references, and it entangles large other parts of Europe and the world indeed, so you can't see it in isolation. And indeed, perhaps least of all in the opening lecture of the series, tonight I'm going to talk about the origins of the war. Now, it used to be thought, both during the war and under the influence of Winston Churchill's massive and widely read 5 volumes in its history, that the war was caused simply by Nazi aggression, and that the British and French should have stood up to it earlier. But this simple explanation was torpedoed by A.J.P. Taylor nearly half a century ago in his book, The Origins of the Second World War, published in 1961. In this provocative work, well, it's provocative like all of his works, which helped, I think, shape the views of a generation of British readers on this topic, Taylor reminded them that in 1939 it was Britain and France who declared war on Germany, not the other way around. Why did they do so, he asked. His answer has largely been accepted by subsequent historians. Britain and France declared war, he argued, for old-fashioned reasons of state. German expansion in Europe was undermining the balance of power, and Britain and France wanted to restore it. Moral objections had nothing to do with it, though, of course, as with the German invasion of neutral Belgium in 1914, they immediately became part of propaganda issued by the Allies. Taylor swept away the rhetoric made popular by Michael Foot and his collaborators in their wartime polemic Guilty Men, which pilloried British Prime Minister Chamberlain and his ministers for appeasing Nazi Germany instead of launching a war, say, in 1936, when the chances of winning it were good. Here, too, Taylor's arguments have largely been accepted by later scholars in the field. Appeasement, far from being politically blind and morally reprehensible, was, he suggested, the only sane and honourable course for the British and French governments to take while German intentions remained unclear, or at least seemed to be confined to a revision of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, this treaty and the associated minor treaties that formed together the peace settlement of 1919 redrew the map of Europe after the defeat of Germany and its allies in the First World War. The peace settlement was regarded soon after its conclusion as unfair to the defeated nations, hypocritical and immoral, a view largely shared by Chamberlain and his government. To begin with, the peace settlement imposed massive financial reparations on Germany for the damage caused in Belgium and northern France by the German armies that invaded and occupied them from August 1914 to November 1918. Economists like John Maynard Keynes condemned reparations almost as soon as they were imposed. And the economic history of the 1920s and 30s seemed to confirm the view that they were fatally damaging to the German economy. I think now this view has been somewhat revised. We now know that the massive hyperinflation of the early 1920s, which shattered the political allegiances of the middle classes in Germany, was caused not least by the actions of the German governments at the time. Essentially, they refused to raise taxes for fear of the political consequences of being accused of taxing the Germans in order to pay the French. The liberal parties, the pro-democracy, pro-Weimar Republic parties collapsed mainly because the middle classes no longer saw them as a necessary bulwark against the threat of a communist revolution once the political position stabilized in the 1920s. But still, none of this is apparent to the large body of opinion in Britain and France that felt guilty about having imposed reparations in the first place. It's often forgotten that reparations came to an end in 1932, so they did not play any direct part in the triumph of Nazism in the following year. And far more important, I think, were the territorial provisions of the peace settlement. Following the principles laid down by US President Woodrow Wilson, the peace treaties redrew the boundaries of European states along the lines of nationality, or at least they tried to. Each nation was to be allowed to determine its own destiny. The great multinational empires, above all the Habsburg monarchy, were duly parcelled out into a number of different national states, with a new or revived Polish state being carved out of parts of the former German, Russian and Austrian empires. But of course, implementing the principle of national self-determination, as it was called, posed insurmountable problems. It left a legacy of bitterness for the future. The lines of ethnicity in Europe were far from clearly drawn in 1919. Pockets of German settlement, some very substantial, existed all over East Central Europe, as far as the Baltic coast of Russia, Romania, Poland, the Czech borderlands, and so on. Everywhere the lines of the new states seemed to many to be drawn to favour nationalities other than the Germans. In the new states, there were large German-speaking minorities as a consequence. Some of the new states curtailed the liberties of these minorities. Poland tried to Polonize German speakers. Ethnic Germans in Czechoslovakia formed a growing source of discontent because they felt themselves disadvantaged in comparison to native Czechs. Alsace-Lorraine, with the majority of German speakers, had been annexed by France, while the Saarland, which was wholly German, had been mandated to France with the promise of a popular vote in 1935 on whether to return to Germany or not. Following this principle, many politicians in Britain and France were persuaded that such minorities should be able to have more of a say over which state they belonged to. In the 1930s, that largely meant Germany. The peace settlement also insisted on creating an independent sovereign state for the 6 million German speakers who lived in what was now the Republic of Austria, or as it was called immediately after the war, German Austria. At the end of the First World War, when the other nationalities of the Habsburg monarchy, Hungarians and so on, had broken off to form their own independent states, the German speakers in Vienna and the surrounding provinces had voted to join the Weimar Republic, which in its turn accepted the policy of union with Austria. After all, German-speaking Austria had been part of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation till its demise in 1806, part of the German Confederation from 1815 up to its abolition by Bismarck in 1866. In other words, it had been part of Germany in one form or another for over a millennium. It only existed outside it for just over half a century. But the Allies thought it was absurd and dangerous for Germany actually to get bigger after having been defeated in the First World War. So they vetoed the idea, contrary to the principle of national self-determination. And this, perhaps more than any other measure of the peace settlement, seemed to many in Britain and France to be a blatant violation of this principle, which had been applied so rigorously to nationalities other than the Germans themselves. Finally, the peace settlement imposed strict limitations on German armaments. The Germans were not allowed to build warships or combat aircraft. All their existing armaments in these areas had to be destroyed. They weren't allowed modern weapons like tanks. Their army was limited to a maximum of 100,000 men. By contrast, there was no corresponding disarmament in other countries, since the Treaty of Versailles affirmed the principle that Germany's aggression had caused the war in the first place. So it was Germany that had to be disarmed in case it happened again. When the parliamentary democracy of the Weimar Republic collapsed in the early 1930s and gave way to the stridently nationalistic regime of the Third Reich, there was a widespread view outside Germany that peace settlement was a major cause of this collapse. A view, of course, strongly encouraged by the Nazis themselves. In fact, there can be little doubt that the real cause was the economic depression that began in the USA in 1929. In the previous year, the Nazis had won less than 3% of the vote in German national elections. 4 years on, in 1932, they scored 37.4%. Hitler began his foreign policy in October 1933 by withdrawing from disarmament talks, protesting that the British and French should refuse to disarm themselves, although Germany had already been disarmed for a decade and a half. But he reassured international opinion by signing a non-aggression pact with Poland in January 1934, signalling his peaceful intentions to the world. Hitler made a bad error of judgment later in the year, however, by backing a botched attempt to absorb Austria into Germany. Although the Austrian Chancellor, Engelbert Dollfuss, was assassinated by a unit of SS men. The coup d'etat failed, not least because the Italian dictator Mussolini moved his troops up to the border and made it clear he wouldn't tolerate the takeover. In addition to this, the SS was absolutely hated at this point by the stormtroopers, brown shirts, who formed the kind of large mass of Nazi paramilitaries in Austria, since it had very shortly before this engineered the assassination of the leader of the German brown shirts and many other leading figures in the movement in the so-called Night of the Long Knives. Germany was isolated as a result of this, and this isolation was deepened in 1935. The people of the Saarland voted, as they were entitled to do, to return to Germany early in the year. Hitler saw this as a confirmation of his regime and declared shortly afterwards that he was introducing universal military conscription and building a military air force and a battle fleet, and equipping his new army with the latest armour, thus repudiating the arms restrictions imposed on Germany by the peace settlement. The French, British and Italian governments responded by meeting in the town of Stresa and agreeing to guarantee the integrity of Austria, and the French concluded an agreement with the Soviet Union. These were security measures that seemed to kind of isolate Germany internationally and try and prevent any further attempts by Hitler to have an aggressive foreign policy. But they were in reality rather half-hearted. Fundamentally, the British and French governments couldn't see what was morally objectionable in the German moves. Domestic public opinion backed them. At the same time, while hoping for the best, it seemed prudent to prepare for the worst. Britain began to modernize and expand its armed forces and equipment, above all, rapidly from 1936 onwards, followed by France. But both countries, of course, had far-flung overseas empires to think of. European politics seemed of secondary importance. As Neville Chamberlain was to exclaim in a radio broadcast during the Czechoslovakian crisis of September 1938, and I'm quoting, "How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing," end quote. And I don't think he'd have used the same words to describe Canada, India, South Africa, or Australia. But he knew the majority of the British electorate still at this time placed these parts of the British Empire far closer to home in their mental map of the world than they did anywhere in Central or Eastern Europe. The Dominions and the rest of the British Empire were reluctant to become involved in a European conflict where Britain's aims seemed uncertain and Britain's role of little relevance to their concerns. And Hitler repeatedly expressed his admiration for the British Empire and claimed he wanted it as an ally, not as an enemy. So, given Hitler's repeated assurances that he had no intention of going any further than righting the wrongs of the 1939 peace settlement, it seemed to the British and French governments, indeed the British and French people, that every effort should be made to avoid a war with Germany. The creation of the League of Nations in 1919 promised an international system which would enable future wars to be avoided. There was a widespread reluctance to return to the old days of saber-rattling and military alliances that most people thought had led to the outbreak of war in 1914. Nobody wanted to repeat the terrible carnage of 1914 to 18, in which many British and French people, including leading figures in both governments, had lost close friends and relatives. There was a general belief that the next war would differ from the first one mainly through the use of massive aerial bombardment of major cities. There was no defense against attacks of this kind. The loss of civilian life would be incalculable. The bombing of the Basque town of Guernica by German and Italian planes in the Spanish Civil War seemed to underline this point. And in 1936, the Italians invaded Ethiopia. They bombed enemy troops from the air with poison gas, making it seem likely that the same thing would happen in other future wars. Hence the manufacture of millions of gas masks and their distribution to the population of London and other cities in the late 30s. Britain was only slowly recovering from economic depression in the mid-30s. France was still sinking into it. The economic costs of waging war seemed to many to be prohibitive. And this view was strengthened by the belief in London and Paris that German rearmament was moving so fast and had reached such an advanced stage after 5 years in 1938 that the prospects of actually winning a war against Hitler's resurgent Reich were dubious. In any case, many key figures in the conservative establishment in the UK, not a few in France as well, particularly amongst the military, admired the way that Hitler seemed to have restored order, prosperity and national pride in Germany. Soviet communism seemed to them to be a far greater threat than Nazism. Germany offered an effective bulwark against Bolshevism. What possible English or French interests were there in Austria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, people asked, that could justify launching a costly war with little prospect of success and the likelihood of weakening Britain and France's grip on their overseas empires? If Hitler did indeed seem at times to speak and act with a belligerence that belied his repeated insistence that he was a man of peace, then perhaps it was argued the wind could be taken out of his sails by giving him what he wanted. Once those provisions of the peace settlement that had caused bitterness and resentment in Germany had been remedied, then there'd be no more reason for German aggression. The radical elements of the Nazi regime would perhaps be tamed. This was the policy, in a word, of appeasement. And all these reasons, I think, influenced British policy towards Nazi Germany and French policy for much of the 1930s. On the 18th of June 1935, the British concluded a naval agreement with Germany that limited the German Navy to just over a third of the size of its British counterpart, which you have to remember, of course, had a worldwide deployment in contrast to the merely European area of operations of the German Navy. The agreement also allowed parity in submarines. This agreement cut the ground from under the Stresa Agreement, and in a further development favourable to Hitler's position, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia left Mussolini internationally isolated with only Hitler as a potential major ally in Europe. So the Rome-Berlin axis was formed the following year by the two countries' joint intervention on the side of Francoist rebels in the Spanish Civil War. On the 7th of March 1936, Hitler marched his troops into the large area of western Germany, the Rhineland, from which they were formally barred by the Treaty of Versailles. Britain and France could see no good reason why a sovereign state should not be able to deploy its own troops in any part of its own territory, so they held back. By 1938, German rearmament had reached a stage where Hitler felt ready to move into Austria, which he annexed on the 12th of March, with no opposition at all from Austria's inhabitants, the great majority of whom were only too happy to leave what they regarded as a failed and unviable state and join what seemed to be an advanced and successful one. In September 1938, Hitler secured an international agreement at Munich with Britain, France and Italy to detach the western, northwestern and southwestern borderlands of Czechoslovakia, inhabited mainly by German speakers, and incorporate them into the Reich. Placed under such heavy international pressure, the Czechoslovak government gave its assent. Now there's the Rhineland. You see the German troops, the lines in which they moved in. That whole area was barred to German troops by the Treaty of Versailles. That's the German arrangements made in Austria once it was taken over, creating provinces of the German Reich, bitterly disappointing to many Austrians who thought that Vienna would be a kind of joint capital with Berlin, and saw instead a lot of Germans coming in from the north and taking over many of their positions and their businesses. That's the ethnic makeup of Czechoslovakia at this time. And you can see that the Germans are based mainly around the northwestern, western and southwestern borders of the country, which is the area largely annexed according to the Munich Agreement. So up to this point then, everything seemed to be going well. Hitler seemed to be appeased. The problems of national self-determination for Germans in states like Austria and Czechoslovakia, created by the Treaty of Versailles, seemed to be being solved. How did the situation get from this point to the outbreak of war a year later, less than a year later? Well, the Munich Agreement, at which a jubilant Chamberlain announced to the British public that he'd secured peace for our time, had the support of the vast mass of the British people. It was clear that, as A.J.P. Taylor noted, they had no appetite for war in September 1938. But on the 15th of March 1939, German armies marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia and took it over. This is not only a clear violation of the Munich Agreement, it was also the first time that Hitler had invaded a country or annexed an area that was not inhabited mainly by Germans. This roused the suspicion in Britain and France that he aimed at more than a mere revision of the Treaty of Versailles. He seemed to need to be aiming at the domination of Europe, and this would clearly, as Taylor noted, upset the balance of power. And by this time, too, it had become apparent to the British and French governments that German rearmament was not so overwhelming as they'd previously thought, while their own programs of arms and armaments were forging ahead and beginning to give them the confidence that they could withstand German aggression, if necessary. The development of radar, backed by the construction of an effective fleet of fighter planes, offered the possibility of defense against aerial bombardment, which nobody thought possible a few years previously. The interests of the empire became involved because Germany was beginning to threaten Britain's wider role in the world through the growing strength of the German battle and submarine fleets. Above and beyond all of this was the knowledge that if Germany secured control over Western Europe, it would acquire the resources of some of the richest economies on the continent and pose a direct threat to Britain across the Channel and the North Sea. Now, the conquest of Rump, Czechoslovakia, convinced the mass of the British electorate, and crucially its representatives in all the political parties, that Hitler's ambitions were effectively limitless, that the British national interest demanded that he should be stopped. And soon afterwards, a German propaganda offensive against Poland began accusing the Poles of maltreating and murdering Polish citizens of German extraction, mostly, nearly all of them made up, of course, stories made up by propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, who was very good at that sort of thing. It seemed obvious to everybody Poland was next on Hitler's list. So the British and French governments issued a guarantee of Polish sovereignty and made it clear to Germany that they'd declare war if it was violated. Yet Chamberlain continued to believe that peace was possible. When Germany did eventually invade Poland at the beginning of September 1939, Chamberlain appeared in the House of Commons and suggested mediation by Italy, giving no time limit for the Anglo-French response. A repeat of the Munich Agreement seemed on the cards. But this time, the mood in the House of Commons and the country was radically different. Conservative backbenchers were appalled at Chamberlain's attempt to renege on the guarantee to Poland. As the Labour Party spokesman, Arthur Greenwood, got to his feet, he was brusquely interrupted. Speaking for the Labour Party, he began. "Speak for England," shouted Leo Amery from the Tory backbenchers. Greenwood did. "I'm greatly disturbed," he said. "An act of aggression took place 38 hours ago. I wonder how long we're prepared to vacillate at a time when Britain and all that Britain stands for and human civilization are in peril." So there's a moral element begins to enter the debate there. And after the session, the Cabinet met and forced Chamberlain to issue an ultimatum to the Germans to withdraw or face a declaration of war from Britain and France. The Germans did not withdraw. War was duly declared. Chamberlain said to the House of Commons, "Everything that I've hoped for, everything I believed in my public life, has crashed into ruins." And what had overwhelmed him in the end was not any rational calculation of Britain's national interest in preserving the balance of power on the continent, so much as an onrush of moral passion that saw Germany as a ruthless aggressor, riding roughshod over one sovereign nation after another and doubtless hell-bent on destroying more. It's time to call a halt. Britain was a leading world power. It was Britain's duty to ensure a stable and, as far as possible, morally justifiable international order on the continent. The widespread belief in the importance of morality in international relations had been one of the forces behind the support for the League of Nations and criticism of the Treaty of Versailles for many years. It was now expressing itself in revulsion against Nazi foreign policy. So what was that policy? Here, I think Taylor was at his weakest. In order to understand his arguments, it's important to realize that under the influence of Sir Louis Namier, with whom he taught at Manchester, and whose Polish-Jewish background gave him an extreme and undying hatred of Germany, the Germans, Taylor belonged to the school of thought in Britain that believed that Germany was predestined to be an international aggressor, summarized in Foreign Office official Robert van Sittart's book, Black Record, based on a series of wartime propaganda broadcasts. Or in the professor of history at King's College London, Fossey Hearnshaw's book, Germany, the Aggressor Through the Ages. Taylor's book belonged in this, the course of German history, belonged in this company. It was commissioned during the war by the political warfare executive of the government, but rejected because it was too anti-German. as well as because it's the man who commissioned it and then recommended its rejection. The left-wing German exile Francis Carsten once told me it was full of basic factual errors as well. In this book, Taylor argued that Germany's lack of natural boundaries made it inevitable that Germany would always seek to expand across Europe until it found boundaries somewhere or other. Whilst there are obvious flaws in the argument, many other countries have no natural boundaries. In any case, rivers are made to be crossed, mountains to be traversed. Natural boundaries often fail to coincide with political ones. If the argument held good, then Germany would never have sought to acquire territory across the River Rhine, like Alsace-Lorraine or the Saarland. It might easily have stopped where it stops now in the east of the rivers Oder and Neisse. Taylor's book might seem to have been a product of wartime propaganda. Yet, in 1961, the same year in which he published The Origins of the Second World War, Taylor reprinted the course of German history without alteration, merely appending a new preface in which he expressed once more his fears that there would be a third German war, as he said, before the end of the 20th century. So it was a rabidly anti-German historian who wrote The Origins of the Second World War, and not an apologist for Hitler, as his German critics thought. When he claimed that Hitler was no more than an ordinary German statesman, like Bismarck or Frederick the Great, he wasn't claiming he was no worse than them, but they were no better than him. But at the same time, as a self-professed believer in the paramount role of chance in history, Taylor sought to deny that Hitler had any personal plan for European, still less world, domination. In the course of a detailed examination of the diplomatic maneuverings of the 1930s, he showed convincingly, often brilliantly, that Hitler changed his mind and direction, the direction of his policy on numerous occasions. Taylor cited the famous memorandum taken by Colonel Friedrich Hossbach at a meeting with the Army, Navy and Air Force chiefs on the 5th of November 1937, when Hitler declared his intention of conquering Czechoslovakia and then Austria. But of course he did it in the reverse order. So Taylor claimed triumphantly he didn't have a plan, simply took advantage of circumstances opportunistically as they arose. In any case, he added for good measure, the memorandum itself was of dubious authenticity and couldn't really be relied on. So Hitler wasn't in the driving seat, German history was. Now, I can't help thinking there's something rather contradictory about these views. Either Hitler was aiming at European hegemony, or he wasn't. The Second World War might have been started by Britain and France declaring war on Germany, but would there have been a war if they hadn't done so? Hitler, it's unclear. Taylor seems to be implying that there would have been a war and there wouldn't have been a war. And in the end, he was only explaining why the war happened when it did. He took for granted, I think, that there would have been a war at some time or other. More to the point, I think Taylor relied wholly on diplomatic documents, speeches, published writings. But even at the time he wrote, there's a good deal of evidence available to document Hitler's intentions, and a good deal more has come to light since. So let me go through some of it. And of course, one has to remember that intentions are not the same as plans, and Taylor tended to confuse the two. I mean, most politicians and statesmen have some kind of longer-term intentional purpose, but how they actually achieve it depends on how they use the chances and circumstances of the moment, depends on their mastery of the art of politics, in other words. Bismarck was a classic example. It was he who coined the phrase, politics is the art of the possible. His intention was to unify Germany without Austria, but he did it by exploiting the convoluted and chance-ridden politics of the Schleswig-Holstein question and the Hohenzollern candidature for the Spanish throne, neither of which was predetermined in any way. Hitler was different. Hitler came from the extreme right-wing fringe of German and Austrian politics, reacting to Germany's defeat in the First World War, generalizing from his experience in the multi-ethnic Habsburg monarchy before that. He saw world history and international relations essentially as a Darwinian struggle between races, Aryans, Latins, Slavs, Anglo-Saxons, and so on, for the survival of the fittest. The world enemy of all of them, especially the Aryans, by which he meant essentially the Germans, possibly or partially Dutch and Scandinavians too, was the Jew. Hitler believed that Jews everywhere were engaged in a coordinated international conspiracy to bring Germany down, and that in fact they'd succeeded in doing so in 1918 by fomenting revolution on the home front and so delivering the infamous stab in the back to the undefeated army, an imitation of Siegfried's death in the Twilight of the Gods. In fact, of course, the German army had been defeated by the superior material resources of the Allies, especially after the United States had joined the conflict. The Allied blockade had cut off food supplies and led to the death from starvation and malnutrition-associated diseases of about 600,000 Germans in the First World War. Allied arms and Allied resources had simply proved superior. Hitler believed that Germany's only chance of long-term survival lay, as he wrote in his book, My Struggle, Mein Kampf, published in 2 volumes in 1925-6, in the acquisition of agricultural land in Eastern Europe. This would be Germany's equivalent to the American West. The communist regime in Russia was, he believed, run by Jews, although in fact, under Stalin, it exhibited markedly anti-Semitic traits. The end of Jewish rule in Russia, Hitler declared in Mein Kampf, will also, and I'm quoting here, will also be the end of Russia as a state. Russia and what he called its vassal border states would be conquered and occupied by Germans to create living space, Lebensraum, by which he meant that German farmers would displace Russians, Ukrainians and Belarusians and establish an agricultural area that would be able to feed Germany in any future conflict and thus allow Germans to live on reasonably comfortably as they'd not been able to do in the First World War. The boundaries of the year 1914, Hitler declared in the book, mean nothing at all for the German future. Well, in 1928, he wrote or dictated a second book, which, however, was never published, or at least not until it was discovered some years after the war. In a remarkable passage in this book, Hitler wrote that American dominance of the world was becoming clear for all to see. It would reduce every European state to the level of Switzerland, which he clearly thought was a very bad thing. The only state that will be able to stand up to North America, he said, will be the one that has understood how, through the essence of its inner life and the meaning of its foreign policy, to raise the value of its people in racial terms and to bring them into the state form most appropriate for this purpose. It is the task of the National Socialist movement to strengthen and prepare its fatherland for this mission. So in other words, putting these 2 books together, Hitler's saying that Germany under Nazis had created a dictatorship based on ethnic purity and capable of achieving domination over the European continent. And in this way, it would be able to face up to the USA, possibly in alliance with the British Empire. So, from the outset, Hitler's ambitions were framed on a global scale. Mein Kampf, of course, was not a blueprint or a plan. But as Hugh Trevor-Roper pointed out in response to Taylor, taken together with other relevant utterances of Hitler, did reveal long-term intentions that never changed, whatever the political or diplomatic maneuvers of the moment. Hitler was quite open about these intentions. On the 23rd of May 1928, he stated publicly that his aim was to save Germany by waging a war into, I quote here, into the most distant future, by securing so much land and ground that the future receives back many times the blood that will be shed, end quote. Shortly after his appointment as Reich Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933, he told 2 American businessmen in a private conversation that he intended to annex Austria, the Polish corridors, a part of Poland which allowed access to the Baltic, Alsace-Lorraine, German-speaking areas in Denmark, Italy, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Romania. On the 3rd of February 1933, just after he'd been appointed Chancellor, head of government, coalition government, on the 30th of January, and his position was still very precarious, Hitler met with senior army officers. He needed their support as he began to unleash his stormtroopers against the enemies of Nazism on the streets in what was eventually a successful bid to drive them out of politics and establish a one-party dictatorship. So he needed to promise to the army officers what he knew that they wanted. He told them openly he would rearm, invade Eastern Europe, and then Germanize it, expelling the native population of Slavs. A year later, in February 1934, he told a meeting of Army, SS, and Stormtrooper leaders that he expected the economic recovery now underway to come to a halt by 1942, but the latest, unless Germany acquired living space in the East. Short, decisive blows, he said, to the West, then to the East, could be necessary. And we know about this, incidentally, because the head of the army at the time, General Hammerstein, had a daughter who was, in fact, a Soviet agent and reported all of this to Moscow. So there's plenty of evidence, quite apart from the Hossbach Memorandum, that attests to Hitler's intention to create living space in the East and defeat Germany's enemies, principally France, in the West. The primacy of rearmament in the early years of his regime was absolute. Of course, some economic historians have argued that he put money into the economy state money in order to reduce unemployment, which is affecting over a third of the workforce in 1933, in which his party had come to power, promising to abolish. But on the 8th of February 1933, he said, I quote here, every publicly supported job creation scheme must be judged by the criterion of whether it's necessary from the point of view of the rearmament of the German people. Rearmament was disguised as job creation in order to deceive the other great powers until it reached a point, as it did in 1935, where Germany was no longer so militarily weak that it posed no deterrent at all to a French invasion of the kind that had happened in the Ruhr in 1923, when Germany had failed to sustain its reparations payments. Even the famous Autobahn and the motorways that Hitler constructed and trumpeted as a kind of job creation scheme, though it wasn't in fact very significant in creating jobs, was organized according to military principles. Hitler envisaged the Autobahns as means of, above all, moving troops, equipment, and so on quickly from one part of the country to the other, although in fact the surface of the roads turned out to be too thin for tanks to go on. And at the beginning of the war, Allied bombers used the gleaming Autobahn roadways as a way of navigation, so they had to be camouflaged. But still, Hitler thought of them as a kind of military device. Well, by 1936, the road to war was open, and not to a limited war with limited objectives, but to a general European war. The four-year economic plan, established under the leadership of Hermann Göring that year, had the explicit aim of preparing the German economy for a general war. Hitler thought a general war was going to come in 1942, but the economy had to be ready well in advance, by 1940. At the meeting recorded in 1937 by Colonel Hosbach, whose minutes, needless to say, of course, are undoubtedly genuine, Hitler announced his intention of conquering Austria and Czechoslovakia, dealing as well with the possible hostility of France. And in the months following the meeting, he replaced the more conservative, cautious members of his government and military, Schacht, Blomberg, Fritsch, Neurath, with men more willing to do his will. Fearing that he might succumb to a fatal illness, so had these sudden anxieties at this point, also feeling more confident than before that Britain and France would not offer any effective barrier to German expansion, Hitler accelerated the pace of his foreign policy, in effect bringing the date of the start of the war forward from 1942 by 2 or 3 years. 2 years was his intention, I think. After the annexation of Austria, Hitler's next aim was not to right another wrong of the 1919 peace settlement by annexing the German-speaking borders of Czechoslovakia, although that's what he said he wanted to do in public, but to remove Czechoslovakia and then Poland from the map altogether as obstacles to Germany's further eastward expansion in pursuit of the goal of living space. On 28th of May 1938, he told his generals and German Foreign Office bureaucrats privately, "I have taken an unalterable decision to smash Czechoslovakia by military action in the foreseeable future." So, as is also to be the case with Poland, the alleged maltreatment of ethnic Germans played up so vociferously by Goebbels' propaganda machine was only really an excuse. What he wanted from the outset was to destroy the Czechoslovak state and then the Polish state. These foreign policy aims were far more radical than those pursued by earlier German statesmen, which is indeed a major reason why Chamberlain failed to recognize them for what they were. This is, generals often fight the last war, as it were. Politicians often look back to previous experience and are misled by it. Bismarck in the 1870s and 80s had declared Germany a satiated power. He was worried about the precarious nature of the unification of Germany in 1871 and simply wanted to stabilize the situation, which he did very successfully 20 years. But after that, of course, the Kaiser, his governments then took up the forward march again. At their furthest extent, German aims in the First World War included the weakening of France, the detachment of major industrial regions from it, annexation by Germany, the incorporation of Belgium and Holland into a German economic empire. Hitler wanted in the long run to absorb what he thought of as Germanic parts of these and the Scandinavian countries into the German Reich itself. He actually wanted Holland and Denmark to be part of the German Reich. So it's far, far more than the leadership of Germany in the First World War ever claimed. In the East, Germany aimed in the First World War to remove territory from Poland and reduce it to a satellite state. Hitler wanted to destroy it altogether. There's no thought in the First World War, of course, of absorbing Austria or creating a German protectorate in Bohemia, both parts of the Habsburg Empire, Germany's principal ally. Crucially, while Germany in the First World War aimed to create an independent buffer state in the Ukraine to cushion the Reich against the potential might of Russia, in the Second World War, in fact long before, Hitler rejected such ideas, even though they were championed by his arch-ideologue Alfred Rosenberg. He aimed merely to annihilate all Eastern European states, along indeed with most of their inhabitants, as we'll see in the second lecture. In the end, though they shared the racial prejudices of their day, the men who led Germany in 1914 to 18 did not see world history and European politics exclusively in racial terms, as Hitler did, though certainly social Darwinist thinking played a role. On the whole, they did not share Hitler's later view of Eastern Europe as Germany's equivalent to the American West, a supposedly empty space whose indigenous inhabitants had to be killed or displaced to make way for new settlers from what he regarded as a civilized part of the continent. Hitler paid little more than lip service to the idea of regaining Germany's lost overseas colonies, and perhaps in the long run gaining more besides. For him, the prospect of empire lay above all in Europe, not in Africa, Asia, or the Pacific. Whereas breaking through into the big league of overseas colonial powers was the major driving force behind the military and naval ambitions of Imperial Germany. And finally, of course, Hitler had a new and fearsome enemy to contend with, namely Communist Russia. While Imperial Germany still thought in conventional terms of states and interstate diplomacy and the diplomatic game, and military conflicts between states which would end with some kind of negotiated settlement, giving Germany the upper hand, Hitler and the Nazis downgraded the importance of the state. They thought in radical terms of races and interracial conflicts instead. So, whatever Taylor claimed, Hitler was no ordinary German statesman. His radical, unlimited ambition emerged out of a radical, almost unlimited set of crises, military, economic, cultural, social, political, that overwhelmed Germany between 1918 and 1933. Hitler's foreign policy was not made in a vacuum, of course. Even a dictatorship has to some extent to take popular opinion into account, otherwise it risks being undermined or overthrown from within. So how far, and this is really my last question, how far did Hitler's policies win the assent of the German people? There's no doubt that one of the factors that won the Nazis the support of more than a third of the electorate in 1932 to 3 was their promise to make Germany great again. But, of course, this wasn't much more than vague, if vehement, rhetoric. What about the actual policies themselves? Here I think there's actually two aspects of German opinion to deal with. The first is represented by the top military officers, the men who'd have to carry out any decision to go to war. They were very nervous in the run-up to the German strike against Austria in March 1938. They'd already been nervous in the remilitarization of the Rhineland. The hesitations of some of them, their attempts to dissuade him, led Hitler to replace them in the months before the invasion. And the Czechs, of course, the Czechs were a much tougher proposition than the Austrians, so that if the army leaders were nervous about the Austrians, they were even more nervous about the Czechs. The Czechs, unlike the Austrians, were undoubtedly overwhelmingly opposed to a German attack. They had a well-trained and well-equipped army. They possessed excellent lines of defense, all of these lacking in Austria. And while Britain and France were likely to tolerate a German absorption of Austria, Czechoslovakia had a formal alliance with France. There was a real possibility of the British backing the French and coming to the aid of the Czechs should there be a conflict. During the Munich crisis of September 1938, extensive preparations for war were indeed made in Britain, including the evacuation of children from major cities and the issuing of gas masks, as Chamberlain mentioned, to people who stayed behind. And all of this caused serious alarm to the German generals, who were aware that the British had been overestimating the extent, degree, and pace of German rearmament. They really didn't think the time was ripe for a war. The chief of the German Army General Staff, Ludwig Beck, told Hitler that German rearmament had not yet reached a point where he could hope to win a war against the combined might of Britain and France. Hitler, furious, sacked him on 18th of August 1938, but he was succeeded by another man, Franz Halder, of rather similar views. And Halder won the support of a number of other officers and some civil servants, particularly in the Foreign Office, Germany, who began to plan a coup d'etat that would begin with the arrest and imprisonment of Hitler and lead on to the establishment of a military regime. These men did not disapprove, it's important to realize, of the idea of invading and dismembering, annexing Czechoslovakia in itself. They simply thought that Hitler was doing it far too soon, and they wanted to wait until there had been an arms build-up and it was more successful. They thought that Hitler was playing with fire, taking terrible risks in wanting to do this in September 1938. When Chamberlain brokered the Munich Agreement, Czechoslovakia was dismembered without any armed intervention. This pulled the rug from underneath the conspiracy, which had got as far as actually planning troop movements, and that hadn't actually worked out what to do with Hitler after arresting him. So the conspirators were forced to abandon their plans. Many of them would later become involved in the bomb plot against Hitler in July 1944 and pay for this with their lives. Hitler's string of foreign policy successes quelled their doubts for the time being. By September 1939, even skeptical army officers believed that Poland, with its brave but ramshackle and poorly equipped military forces, would be far easier to defeat than the Czechs would have been. They were confident that another year of headlong rearmament had given them sufficient force to defeat the British and the French should they decide to step in. But crucially, they thought, in the end, just as Hitler did, that Britain and France would not intervene, or at least the British wouldn't intervene. So many occasions before they'd stood aside or tried to broker a peaceful settlement, and the same would surely be true in the case of Poland, as indeed, as I've suggested, it very nearly was. The second part of opinion in Germany, that of the population at large, was also far from overwhelmingly supportive of a war. As in Britain, most people were deeply apprehensive, even fearful at the prospect of another general European war, for very similar reasons. Secret agents reporting on popular opinion to the exiled German Social Democratic Party leadership in Prague reported that during the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, which had been accompanied by preparations for air raid protection all over Germany, in case the French responded by bombing German cities, I quote, "The people are very worked up. They're afraid of war," end quote. Similar fears are expressed by ordinary Germans over the Austrian crisis in March 1938. SS security surveillance reports reported what they called a war psychosis during the long drawn-out months of the crisis over the summer 1938 over Czechoslovakia. And Social Democratic agents reported at this time, quote, "Nowhere is there any enthusiasm for war to be found. If it comes to a war, this war will be as unpopular in Germany as possible." What Germans essentially wanted, and this went for Germans of almost every class and political colouring, apart from real Nazi fanatics, was the re-establishment of German greatness without blood being shed. And this, of course, time and again, is exactly what Hitler gave them. Every time they were afraid a war would break out, whether in 1935 over conscription, 36 over the Rhineland, 38 over Austria or Czechoslovakia, it did not. Hitler's popularity increased hugely with every victory. He got this reputation amongst the Germans of being a wizard statesman who could produce these major successes in foreign policy without actually firing a shot in anger. German propaganda, German media, German education under the Nazis were geared from 1933 to preparing Germans for war and making them enthusiastic for it. Heroism, self-sacrifice, courage, daring do, aggressiveness, all these things were urged upon Germans of every age and every class. But this massive indoctrination from the media, the education, radio, cinema, newsreels, newspapers, magazines, all the rest of it, Hitler Youth and so on. All this indoctrination did not actually have the desired effect. Some of the younger generations who'd known little else but life under Nazism were influenced by this, but the great majority, especially those who'd experienced the First World War and knew what it was like, continued to be apprehensive about another major military conflict. In August and September 1939, it was just the same. The American reporter William L. Shirer went out in the streets of Berlin when war was finally declared at the beginning of September 1939, looking for the cheering crowds that had thronged the main squares and thoroughfares on the 1st of August 1914, but he found only silent, empty streets and a general, what he called astonishment and depression on the faces of people whom he encountered. Surveillance reports by the SS registered what was called despondency among the population. The mood everywhere at the beginning of the war was subdued and concerned rather than euphoric or aggressive. But soon, all this was to change. I'll explore this change of mood in Germany, the reasons for it and its effects in next month's lecture. Thank you very much.
On that last point, I've often wondered, in the aftermath of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, would it have been possible for the Germans and indeed the Soviets to say to the Poles, right, now we've got you over the proverbial barrel, and to have acquired through negotiation rather than through conflict what they wanted? The Soviets taking back what they'd lost in 1921 and the Germans taking back Danzig. In other words, was war necessarily inevitable? Had this hypothesis happened, of course, it would have put the British and the Americans in an even more awkward quandary than they were in the first place.
Yes, very interesting question. Just a few weeks before the outbreak of the war, Germany and Soviet Russia, to everyone's total astonishment, signed a non-aggression pact. This is designed by Hitler and his foreign minister, Ribbentrop, to, as it were, secure his invasion of Poland. And indeed, there were secret clauses. The whole thing was, the clauses were secret to allow the Russians to occupy the roughly eastern third of Poland, while the Germans occupied the western two-thirds. This pact was greeted with total consternation in Germany. And in fact, a Nazi party headquarters in Munich the next morning, the front garden was full of Nazi party badges that outraged Nazi party members had torn off their jackets and thrown in there in protest. But very soon, of course, most people came around to the view in Germany that this was another example of Hitler's genius. They realized it was purely tactical. It was tactical, however, not because Hitler simply wanted a peaceful takeover of Poland. You could spin out a scenario, as you did, saying, of course, it would be much better and much easier had it all been done by agreement and so on. I think the problem with that is that the Poles, from the very beginning, would actually absolutely refuse to negotiate. They were not like the Czechs. They simply dug their heels in and they said, we're not going to have any kind of discussions about this. We're a sovereign nation. We're not going to tolerate any kind of territory being taken off or any change in the status quo. Hitler was extremely cross about this, and he thought this stubborn resistance was outrageous, and indeed it radicalized his whole policy in Poland and made it clear that it caused him to abandon his earlier idea that he'd sort of create a puppet state in Poland, and he simply resolved to wipe it completely from the map. So it's kind of it's part of the Polish objections and also partly the nature of Hitler's drive to war. The whole essence of Hitler's foreign policy, that it was geared towards having a war. And one can say, well, it would be more sensible not to have a war, but that's sort of rather mistakes, I think, what's essentially is driving him. Yeah. Any other questions?
How far do you think Hitler's policy towards the Slavic countries, and especially Ukraine, was influenced not just by considerations of Lebensraum and breadbasket of Europe and so on, but sort of underlying geopolitical theories that were knocking around in the first part of the 20th century, Mackinder and the geographical pivot of history and the idea that the cockpit of Eurasia had to be controlled by those who would hold power as well as, have food. Was that part of his thinking, that whole kind of geopolitical worldview, going back to Tamburlaine and...
In a sense, yes. Yeah, I mean, I think that Hitler and most of his leading advisors had this vision of an Eastern Europe, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, a large chunk of Western Russia, would, as an area which would be dominated and conquered and occupied by Germans. And I'll talk in more detail about this in one of the later lectures in connection with what became known as the General Plan for the East, which governed Nazi policy towards these areas. There was this pragmatic side to it. Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe, all the massive resources, also industrial and raw materials of other sorts. But what was underlying it all was this racial view, this racist view of the Slavs as being inferior, not subhumans as they were called by the Nazis, who didn't really deserve to be there at all. This is a view that was opposed by, as I mentioned, by Alfred Rosenberg, who was a Baltic German, who said, well, look, Ukrainians have had a terrible time at the hands of the Soviets. Stalin has created a huge famine there. They're all violently opposed. Why don't we use this? They're all on our side. And indeed, when the German armies went into Ukraine, they were welcomed by peasants with the traditional gifts of bread and salt and so on. But Hitler would have none of this. As far as he was concerned, they were simply racially inferior and had to be wiped off the face of the earth.
Reference the size and stability of the German population. Could you say a few words on that? And also, I understand it was that the actual war was fueled by the very nature, the ambience, the innateness of the Aryan presence that fueled essentially the sheer onslaught and fury of acquiring lands for purity of the race.
So what was the first question about the population?
The population, was it expanding or stable?
Oh, I see,
if it was expanding, then obviously they would want more space to live, which is a very common reason for conquering. But I understand before the actual second, in the early 1930s, it was relatively stable.
There's two aspects to that. I mean, one is that I'm not at all sure that, one is that I don't really think that an expanding population causes states to wage war against other states. In the industrial world, you can sustain almost any level of population, providing you get the resources right. It's not like the pre-industrial world. So that Germany was not kind of overcrowded. I think the notion of an overcrowded country is rather dubious. I mean, Britain is now the most heavily populated country in Europe, but I don't see us trying to invade France. So I think that whole principle is a rather questionable one. The German birth rate, like that of all European, almost all European countries at that time, was in a state of rapid decline and had been since the late 19th century. That was one of the things that Hitler tried to reverse by giving the notorious Mother's Cross to women with 10 children and various premiums to mothers and so on. Incidentally, very similar policies in France, in Italy, and in Stalin's Russia as well, trying to increase the birth rate. So it was in a situation of decline. When Hitler said living space, he didn't actually mean that sort of Germans were just only had standing room only in the Reich and we had to go somewhere else. What he meant was this idea of the American West. It was very present in his mind, or Australia, as he used to talk about sometimes. This sort of space where Germans could go and create some kind of agricultural utopia with large farms, German cities linked by autobahns and high-speed railways and so on. So it's not to do with overcrowding. It's to do with the conquest of a space which will enable Germans to dominate Europe and create a kind of superpower to rival the Americans and the British.
Given the strength of the Czechoslovakian army at the time, Why do you think, though, and even Austria's as a new country, as it were, why do you think those countries so easily capitulated to Hitler? It seems that Hitler had some kind of insight into what those people wanted. Was it a question of getting rid of the old guard and economics? Or was there some other reason, do you think?
Well, there is, of course, in those countries too, a general fear of war and armed conflict at this time. And the Czechs, I think, were particularly under very, very heavy pressure. They had no friends. They were under huge pressure from Europe's leading powers, the British, the French, the Italians, and the Germans. All were forcing them to surrender this territory. And indeed, the way in which 2 million ethnic Germans have been incorporated in Czechoslovakia was a kind of moral lever as well. The Austrians, a rather different case. Both the major political camps were essentially in favour of unity with Germany for different reasons. The more conservative Christian social movement had gone over to the idea of a sort of more German nationalism, the fellow feeling with Germans and so on. The Social Democrats thought of Germany as a more advanced country, so it would, as it were, bring the revolution nearer somehow the time they joined. By the time the Nazis took over, very shortly after that, Austria became a dictatorship in which Social Democrats were arrested and imprisoned. So for many Social Democrats, it didn't seem to be any much worse to be part of a larger Germany, which is also a dictatorship. Even the leading Social Democrat, Karl Renner, publicly approved the Anschluss. So there's simply a lack of belief in the viability of a small independent Austrian state.
You said that it was under the Nazi Party that they, said that they undervalued the idea of the state and had to go for a much greater victory. But wasn't there a sort of ideas of that in the First World War? I mean, the German High Command, when it was a military dictatorship, wanted to have peace through victory, and maybe it was the huge costs of war, in casualties and resources, that forced that kind of view of victory.
Yes, I mean, when I was trying to argue about the Nazis not taking the state very seriously, they thought the state was a kind of lumbering, slow, bureaucratic, immovable object, and they wanted flexibility. They want, and this becomes the case increasingly during the war, that the Nazi movement and the SS elbow the state aside in all sorts of areas, because they think it's a rule-bound, and they don't want a rule-bound system. In terms of international conflict, it's clear the Nazis thought in terms of races as being the essential elements, Slavs versus Latins or whatever it might be. Whereas I don't think this is nearly so much the case in the First World War. I certainly agree, of course, Hindenburg and Ludendorff wanted to win the war and achieve a peace through victory, but it would be a peace in which the German state, the German Reich, would be the winning power. They did not really think in terms of predominantly in terms of as whether Germanic or Aryan race being the victorious entity. Okay, well, thank you very much for those interesting questions. I look forward to seeing you at the next lecture in November. Thank you very much.